Okay, hi. Before we get to the main topic, I will first like to point out that in my comments, I've placed a link that will take you to information about technology that has been curing early stage prostate cancer for over 2 decades without any hospital stay or an operation. Okay, now this presentation is about General Daniel Chappie James. He was a flight instructor at Tuskegee Institute and was one of the very first African American pilots in the U.S. military. This is a photo of the Tuskegee Airmen, but I don't know for a fact that Chappie James is in this specific photo. In this video, you will see a summary of the General's education and experiences, with comments from those that knew or have researched him.
When he reported for flight training, there were those who thought he was too large to fit into a cockpit. He wasn't. He became an outstanding pilot and trained hundreds of African-American aviators for World War II. He flew more than 100 missions in Korea and 78 in Vietnam. During a coup in Libya, he faced down Muammar Gaddafi when the dictator threatened to take an American airbase hostage. Appointed to head the Strategic Air Command, he became the Air Force's first black 4-star general. In every assignment, he lived by what his mother had taught him. That you can be whatever you want if you want it badly enough to contribute, to prepare, and to persevere. He did all of those. He is General Daniel Chappie James, and he is a legend of air power. Daniel Chappie James was born February 11th, 1920 in Pensacola, Florida. His father worked for the local utility company. His mother was a school teacher.
It was reported that there were 17 children born into the family. He was the youngest. Now, I don't know how much of that is true, how much of that is folklore, but certainly there were as many as 6 to 7 kids in the home at one time. As other children left to go to start their own families, to start working or go to school.
James's mother, who everyone called Miss Lily, dominated the household and, in fact, the community. She founded a school for black children that taught its students much more than just reading and writing.
And I never realized how close he was with his mother and what a great influence she was on him until he started making speeches and gave some quotes of hers as an educator. She believed very strongly in education, of course. But one of the things she believed in that many young people don't have today is that dream that carries you through some adversity and keeps you focused on achieving something that's extraordinary.
She taught that the only way they could overcome the South's segregation and discrimination was through hard work and excellence. She created an 11th commandment, "Thou shalt not quit," and insisted that her students pursue every opportunity to stand out, no matter how small.
Now, the interesting thing about Pensacola was that unlike many southern communities, it was not as segregated, and it had a history of blacks pursuing opportunities and being part of the social fabric. There were a lot of black professionals that owned shops and worked in a variety of capacities and even lived on the same streets as whites. And so he grew up in a community that, although suffering from its own share of racial woes, probably gave him some early insight into what was possible when blacks and whites worked together.
Pensacola was home to the Navy's flight training school, and at a very young age, Chappie declared that he wanted to be a pilot. When he got old enough, he went to the Pensacola Naval Air Station and tried to enlist. He was told in no uncertain terms that the Navy did not have African-American pilots.
If he wanted to be a cook or a steward, he could go and get in that line like the rest of the colored boys were doing and join.
Instead, James accepted a football scholarship to Tuskegee Institute. He arrived in 1937. A year later, the War Department set up an outpost of the new civilian pilot training program in the fields adjacent to the Institute. There was, in reality, nothing civilian about the pilot training there. The intent of the program was to increase the pool of pilots available to fight the war brewing in Europe and Asia.
The Air Force up to that time had been a private reserve for white officers, and it was presumed to be the preserve for white officers because blacks were not capable of flying these highly technical new aircraft that constituted the new weapon of warfare. And therefore, blacks were totally eliminated from the Air Force, and not only from the Air Force, but from the Marine Corps, for instance, from the Navy, except as stewards. Anything that had a technical capability to it, blacks were eliminated from.
James enrolled as a cadet in the program. He quickly distinguished himself as both a pilot and a leader. He also met his future wife, Dorothy.
He was pretty impressed with himself. She was not that impressed with him at first, and so he pursued.
James graduated 4 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor with a BS in physical education and a pilot certification. Tuskegee invited him to stay on as a flight instructor. It's difficult to overstate the significance of what was then called the Tuskegee experiment. A generation of African Americans had, like James, been inching slowly forward toward equality. In the coming war, they saw an opportunity to prove themselves, to pay dues they did not owe, so that when the war was over, they might be treated as full citizens. Given a chance to fly, the best educated, most motivated black men from all over the country converged on Tuskegee. They were greeted by an officer corps that cut them no slack, that believed they would have to be better than white pilots to get the same treatment. Flight instructor Chappie James was among the toughest.
The thing is, he was always pushed by his mother to seek excellence, to be steadfast, and to seek for perfection and all this kind of thing. He grew up with that kind of an orientation, and so when he entered the military phase of flying, well, then he just took those values along with him.
For nearly a year, James taught cadets as a civilian instructor. In 1943, he became a cadet himself and received his commission as a first lieutenant that summer. He asked for a combat assignment, but instead remained at Tuskegee as an instructor. He finally got on the combat track when the Air Corps decided to form an African-American bomber squadron. James was training in B-25s when the war came to an end. In the largest mustering out in history, with millions of men around the world going from uniform to civilian life, Chappie James decided to stay in the Air Corps. That the Air Corps treated him like a second-class citizen seemed not to matter. He was flying. He was serving the country that he loved. And he was convinced that he could change both for the better. The Air Force that Chappie James served in the years after World War II was segregated both officially and unofficially. With a fighter pilot's healthy scorn for authority, he practiced a kind of quiet civil disobedience that pointed out the absurdity of segregating military officers by race.
He became involved with incidents at white-only clubs on military establishments, which he did not think was appropriate. And at an early age in the Army Air Forces, he stepped forward and would not accept that, which that in itself made him a very controversial figure.
One of James's favorite maneuvers was something he called Operation Checkerboard. Even after the Air Force itself desegregated, many Air Force bases were located in rural southern communities still subject to Jim Crow laws. In movie theaters, for example, blacks and whites had seating set aside on opposite sides of the aisle.
When the movie theater lights would go down and the movie would come on, they would enact what they called Operation Checkerboard. And they would end up sitting, by the time the movie finished, black, white, black, white, black, white. It obviously, it didn't make any lasting difference, but it was something that struck a little blow.
But James's most effective tool of protest was excellence. When confronted with discrimination, he put into action something his mother had told him. Don't be so busy exercising your right to dissent that you forget your obligation to contribute. He earned the respect of his fellow pilots by working harder than anyone else on the base. Assigned to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, James found himself in a familiar position, the only black officer in his squadron. He walked into the 18th Fighter Wing not knowing what kind of a reception he'd get. He'd been there only a few minutes when a wiry little Texan walked up and introduced himself.
He was the first person to greet my dad when he walked into that squadron. When everyone else kind of ignored him, he walked up and stuck his hand and said, "Hi, my name is Spud Taylor. What's yours?"
James and Claude Spud Taylor became fast friends. They flew together whenever their schedules allowed. A few months after they met, they took off for a training flight in a tandem seat T-33. The plane's engine flamed out, and the two young pilots crashed in a sugarcane field. The impact spread jet fuel over the whole area and knocked Taylor out. James struggled free from the wreckage, but went back in when he saw his friend strapped helplessly in his seat. He pulled Taylor out, still unconscious, before the fuel could ignite. In 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. James volunteered to be one of the first flyers to reinforce South Korea. He did it without hesitation, though his life had changed. He was no longer a pilot without responsibilities. He was instead a husband and a father of two.
I can remember that something very serious was happening because my father gave me the speech, you and your sister take care of your mom, do what she says, I want you to be good in school and so forth, and all that. And I remember seeing my mother cry for only the first time when they said their goodbyes and he got on the transport to leave to go to Korea.
James flew 101 missions, first in outdated F-51s and then in F-80 jets. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross and proved himself a battlefield leader. He also learned the lesson that all warriors have to learn. In the days just after the landing at Incheon, James and the other 12th Squadron pilots were softening up North Korean positions near the invasion site. Bombing and strafing the Pyongyang airfield in preparation for a paratroop landing, Spud Taylor was shot down.
I remember that when Uncle Spud went away and Dad went away, I figured it would be okay because Uncle Spud was there. And come to find out, Uncle Spud was shot down and he was killed. And that's the second time I remember my mother crying.
James came back from Korea a captain, a more serious and more committed officer. He and his wife had a third child, whom they named Claude and called Spud. James went back to work on his career, moving from assignment to assignment, improving himself along the way, and always seeking positions of more responsibility. After the Korean War, Chappie James was one of dozens of former Tuskegee airmen working their way up through the Air Force. He attracted attention wherever he went, constantly pursuing excellence, working aggressively to advance his own career.
He was very, I think, courageous in many ways because even though he was on the rise and he could have his career thwarted at any time by a commanding officer who didn't like his attitude or whatever, he was always the diplomat. He could always the politician. He could always maneuver himself out of things that might hurt him at one time. But his goal was excellence, always. And anytime he was an administrator on the ground or a pilot in the air, then he always tried to be the best.
He became operations officer of the 58th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, and then was promoted to command of another fighter squadron. At Otis Air Force Base, he was such a huge presence on both the base and in the community that he was named Young Man of the Year by the Massachusetts Junior Chamber of Commerce. The Air Force sent him to the Command and Staff College in 1957, and when he graduated, assigned him to Air Force Headquarters as a staff officer. James was paving the way for a generation to follow, and he knew it.
I think he had a tremendous amount of natural charisma that not only made people want to pay attention to him and what he was doing, but also made people want to follow him. And obviously, if people are willing to follow you, then you're much more likely to be put in a position of authority over them.
He moved steadily up the ladder at every assignment, meeting and impressing people no matter what role he played. He made friends easily, was comfortable in command, and proved effective in everything he did. One of the people he met and befriended was Colonel Robin Olds, a brilliant tactician and fighter pilot. Olds, on his way to an assignment in the growing war in Vietnam, paid a visit to James, then Deputy Commander for Operations of a crew training wing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. Olds invited James to join him in Thailand, flying missions over Vietnam. James accepted the job, becoming Olds' Vice Commander for Operations.
They were an interesting pair. Olds was a natural pilot, natural leader, was an absolute genius at aerial combat tactics and strategies. And Colonel James complemented that tremendously well with his people skills, with his ability to rally the men, with his administrative strengths. And the two of them really worked hand in hand to create an outfit that was not only effective, but was also incredibly loyal to both of them.
Together, James and Olds converted the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing from a sleepy reconnaissance unit into one of the best combat fighter wings in the Air Force.
The men that flew for Olds and James referred to the two of them affectionately as Black Man and Robin. Now, it was a humorous tribute to the cartoon characters Batman and Robin, but it also reflected their opinion of the way that this team operated cohesively.
Flying the new F-4 Phantom, James flew 78 combat missions in Vietnam, including Operation Bolo. Olds designed Bolo to lure the North Vietnamese Air Force into combat, something the communist pilots avoided. Bolo was a huge success. American pilots shot down 7 MiGs, more than any other operation in the war. While in Vietnam, James wrote an essay about his feelings of patriotism. The essay was a reflection both of what he'd learned in his life and what his mother had taught him. Titled America, My Freedom, My Responsibility. The essay was a shot across the bow of the growing counterculture movement back in the United States. It challenged people not just to demand freedom, but to work and sacrifice for it.
He was always the patriot, and he adhered to patriotic fervor more than he adhered to civil rights kind of demonstrations. And many people didn't like that about him, and were very derisive in their criticism of some of his attitudes, as opposed to his feeling for civil rights and feeling as a patriot and his duties toward the military.
Chappie James was always willing to stand up and explain to people very clearly why he loved America and what its value was, and he wouldn't back down from that kind of fight.
James returned from Vietnam in 1967. The general, he became a lightning rod for public scorn of the military. Because he was black, he suffered doubly for professing loyalty to a country that black leaders of the time considered nearly genocidal. He deflected some of the criticism by wearing a Black Panther on his flight helmet, joking that he was a Black Panther who fought for his country, not with it. He moved through a couple of assignments. He was up for a command position, but was passed over. A second position opened up, and James didn't get that either.
And when he didn't get that position, he called a friend by the name of then Colonel Jumper and asked him to help him get an assignment in a command position anywhere. And he said, Chappie, the only thing we've got coming up for the number one slot is for a flying training group in Libya, North Africa. And it's not a big wing or anything. He said, I'll take it. I've got to move to the command position or else I'm dying on the vine here.
There was probably no assignment less visible than Libya. It was command, but it also bore the risk of being so far out of the public eye that James's career might die on the vine there as well. History intervened, however, when a minor officer in the Libyan army staged a coup that threw the king out of power. Muammar Gaddafi took command of Libya and turned his attention to the American air base there. In a nationalist outburst, he threatened to attack the American base and take those stationed there hostage. The situation seemed tailor-made for James. His mixture of pure personal power and diplomatic skills saved the day, and Gaddafi backed down.
Everyone knows what followed with Muammar Gaddafi, but I will tell you that many of the airmen and NCOs and officers who were there, and their families in particular, have come to me subsequently and told me what a comforting feeling it was to have such a strong-willed, strong, dynamic, protective commander there. Because if it had not been for Chappie James, they feel that what we later experienced in Iran would have happened in Libya. Americans taken hostage and kept and held as hostage for many, many months.
James returned to the United States a highly visible hero. The Air Force made him Commander-in-Chief of the North American Air Defense Command, the keeper of America's nuclear force. The job carried with it a promotion to 4-star general, which made James the first African-American 4-star in the history of the Air Force. James achieved the most that could be achieved. He also changed the Air Force and, in the process, his country. His career stood as proof that no aspect of Air Force operations was beyond the capabilities of African Americans. He had demanded and received excellence from a generation of young officers, white and black, guaranteeing that though he may have been the first African American 4-star, he would not be the last. And he had stood up publicly for his country in time of extreme civil strife, when it would have been much easier for him to remain silent.
I think that Chappie James' true strength was not as much as a pilot, though obviously that was something he loved and something he was extremely good at. But I think one of his real strengths was his ability to promote and market not only himself, but his vision of what America was, what the American military was, and what it could be in an integrated and free society.
Okay, thank you for watching. And here's a reminder, there is a link in my comments to take you to information about technology that has been curing early stage prostate cancer for over 2 decades without any hospital stay or operation. Please check that out. And again, thank you for watching.